It was late on a warm spring night in El Paso, Texas. Four teenage boys were walking home after a party, their voices echoing softly in the quiet streets. Then, headlights, a car slowing behind them. Moments later, gunfire shattered the silence. Two of them fell. The others ran. When the chaos stopped, the streets were stained with blood, and a city demanded answers. But what happened next would lead to one of the most controversial cases in Texas history, and a confession that changed a young man's life forever. If you're a fan of true crime and criminal investigations, you won't want to miss our new book, The Ultimate Book of Serial Killers: 180 Files of the World's Most Notorious Murderers, now available on Amazon. You can also purchase the PDF version directly from our website for instant download. You'll find the link in the video description and in a pinned comment. Now, let's dive into today's case. Daniel Villegas was born on April 1, 1977, in El Paso, Texas, a border city shaped by cultural richness and complex social realities. Raised by his mother, Yolanda Villegas, in a large, close-knit family, Daniel grew up surrounded by love, laughter, and neighborhood connections. From an early age, he stood out for his cheerful, extroverted nature and his playful habit of telling wildly exaggerated stories. It was this light-hearted spirit that made him popular among friends, not for academic achievements or ambition, but for his laid-back charm and sense of humor. At 16, Daniel was navigating the ordinary rhythms of teenage life. Weekends filled with small neighborhood parties, idle afternoons on the streets, and endless conversations about music, cars, and the latest gossip. But beneath that normalcy, El Paso in the early 90s was under pressure. Gang activity was rising. The public was demanding fast justice, and the police were often expected to produce quick answers in high-profile crimes, no matter the cost. It was in this tense atmosphere that Daniel's life changed forever. On the night of April 10, 1993, Good Friday, four teenage boys were walking home from a party in northeast El Paso. As they made their way down Electric Street, a brown car slowly approached them from behind, causing unease. The car veered off briefly, then returned moments later, its headlights now off. Without warning, shots rang out from the back seat. Panic erupted. Bullets tore through the quiet night, striking two of the teens. 18-year-old Robert England was shot in the head and died instantly. 17-year-old Armando Lazo was hit in the abdomen and leg. He ran for about 100 meters before collapsing and dying near a neighbor's home. The two surviving boys, Jesse Hernandez and Juan Medina, escaped unharmed but terrified. Police arrived to find a chaotic scene. Two young men dead, no eyewitnesses able to identify the shooter, and the only physical evidence being 6.22 caliber shell casings. The city was shaken. Local media quickly dubbed it the Good Friday shooting, and pressure mounted for answers. With no fingerprints, no murder weapon, no DNA, and no suspects, detectives turned to the most available tool in their arsenal: forced confessions. They began interrogating local teenagers with any ties to gang activity. Among them was David Rangel, who told investigators that his cousin, Daniel Villegas, had once joked about being the shooter. That single offhand comment was enough for police to act. On April 22nd, just 12 days after the murders, 16-year-old Daniel was arrested and taken into custody. He was interrogated for hours, alone, without a lawyer or parent present. Under intense psychological pressure, intimidation, and fear, Daniel eventually broke. He signed a written confession detailing the shooting, even though the account was riddled with inconsistencies and inaccuracies. The moment he left the room, he recanted the confession to a probation officer, insisting he had lied out of fear. But it was too late. Daniel's coerced statement became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Despite lacking any physical evidence, he was charged with capital murder. His first trial, held in December 1994, ended in a hung jury. Several witnesses, including his cousin David, recanted their earlier claims. A forensic psychiatrist testified that Daniel had emotional vulnerabilities and signs of mild intellectual disability. The jury couldn't reach a unanimous decision. But in a second trial held in August 1995, everything changed. With the same coerced confession as the centerpiece of the case, and despite recantations, Daniel Villegas was found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. By 1997, all appeals had been denied. Daniel, once a spirited, playful teenager, now faced a future behind bars. Life in prison was brutal. He endured violence, isolation, and psychological trauma. Yet somehow, through it all, he never gave up hope. Behind prison walls, Daniel Villegas faced more than a wrongful conviction. He also faced fatherhood. His first daughter was born while he was still navigating the early stages of his legal battle. The details about her mother remain largely private, but years later, Daniel would admit that his absence strained the relationship, creating a painful distance he would carry with him. Despite the isolation and hardship, Daniel was never truly alone. His mother, Yolanda, remained a constant source of strength, visiting, writing, and standing by his side through every setback. Her unwavering support would prove vital in the years to come. By 2007, after more than a decade behind bars, a spark of hope appeared in the form of John Mimbela, a local construction businessman who had married into Daniel's extended family. What began as a simple favor evolved into a full-fledged mission. Mimbela immersed himself in the case, reading transcripts, police reports, and trial documents. He quickly became convinced that Daniel had not only been coerced into confessing, but that no physical evidence linked him to the crime at all. Mimbela approached the district attorney with his findings, only to be dismissed. Undeterred, he launched his own campaign for justice. He filed a writ of habeas corpus, arguing that Daniel had received ineffective legal representation at trial. The petition was later expanded to include a declaration of actual innocence, bolstered by new witness statements. Among those who came forward was Jesse Hernandez, one of the surviving victims from the 1993 shooting. Upon reading Daniel's so-called confession for the first time, Jesse publicly questioned its authenticity. He stated that it didn't read like something written by someone who had actually been at the scene. In a stunning revelation, Jesse also disclosed that the same detective who had interrogated Daniel had pressured him with similar tactics, threats, and fear, to the point that Jesse, a victim himself, almost confessed to a crime he hadn't committed. Daniel's cousin David Rangel also recanted. He admitted he wasn't sure whether Daniel had been joking when he supposedly confessed to the crime years ago. Adding to the growing body of new evidence, investigators uncovered information about two local gang members, including Rudy Flores, who had reportedly threatened one of the victims weeks before the shooting. According to witnesses, Flores later bragged about being involved. Armed with these revelations, Mimbela intensified his efforts. He organized fundraisers and brought in civil rights groups to help mount a serious legal defense. Together with Daniel's family, they staged protests, put up billboards, and painted messages on car windows throughout El Paso demanding Daniel's release. Their pressure worked. In 2011, a series of hearings were held to re-examine the case. The defense laid out the inconsistencies between Daniel's confession and the physical evidence. They also highlighted the questionable tactics used by the police, especially during the interrogations of Daniel, Jesse, and Juan, the other surviving witness, none of whom had ever identified Daniel as the shooter in court. A key moment came when Rudy Flores, now considered a possible suspect, invoked his right not to testify. Finally, in August 2012, a judge reviewed the new evidence and issued a recommendation. Daniel Villegas should be granted a new trial. The court ruled that his confession had been coerced, that his defense had been inadequate, and that new evidence pointed to other suspects. Though the state initially appealed, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the ruling in December 2013 and overturned Daniel's conviction. Not long after, the judge formally suppressed the confession, calling it unreliable and improperly obtained. In January 2014, Daniel Villegas was released from prison on bond. He had spent nearly 20 years behind bars. During his time in prison, Daniel had received a letter from a woman named Amanda Faith Rodriguez. She had seen his story in the news and reached out with words of encouragement. That letter sparked a connection rooted in faith, hope, and shared belief in second chances. After Daniel's release, the two married and went on to have 3 children together. For the first time, Daniel was able to be present for the birth of his children, unlike the daughter he had watched grow up from afar. By the time of his release, she was already a young woman in her 20s. Rebuilding that bond would prove difficult, a deep regret that Daniel would carry with him. But despite the suppressed confession and the lack of physical evidence tying Daniel to the crime, the district attorney was not finished. In a controversial move, prosecutors announced plans to try Daniel a third time. This time, the stakes were even higher. Daniel now had a wife and 3 small children. He had tasted freedom and was working to rebuild his life. But he was still haunted by the shadow of that 1993 shooting and the fear that one courtroom decision could send him back to prison forever. In a powerful interview, Daniel sat alongside Amanda and their children. His face bore the weight of 2 decades lost, but his voice carried a message of resolve. He spoke with cautious hope, knowing that his family was both his reason to fight and his greatest vulnerability. The third trial would be the final chapter in a saga that began when he was just a teenager. In October 2018, Daniel Villegas returned to court for the third and final trial that would determine his fate. This time, the controversial confession that had once sealed his conviction was no longer admissible. For the first time, Daniel would be judged without the words that had been forced from him decades earlier. Midway through the proceedings, the prosecution extended an offered plea. Legally, it would allow Daniel to maintain his innocence while still accepting a guilty verdict. In return, he would walk free. On paper, it was a tempting deal. After 4 years out on bond, Daniel had rebuilt his life. He had a wife, young children, a job, and a fragile sense of normalcy. But accepting the plea also meant shouldering the permanent weight of a murder conviction, something he had already carried unjustly for more than 2 decades. He knew that while the plea might guarantee his freedom, it would forever stain his name. In that moment of doubt, another exoneree stepped forward, Jason Baldwin, one of the West Memphis Three, who had taken an Alford plea himself years earlier. He urged Daniel not to compromise, to take the stand, face the trial, and fight for full exoneration. Baldwin's words hit home. Daniel made a decision. He would not admit to a crime he didn't commit. Not again, not ever. The stakes were enormous. The fear of returning to prison haunted Daniel and his wife, but they agreed. The best strategy was to let the prosecution present its case, without interruption. The defense made the bold choice not to introduce new evidence or call any witnesses, not even Daniel himself. It was a calculated move. They believed the prosecution's case had no real foundation without the confession, and to present a defense might only validate a narrative that had no business being in court. The true risk wasn't conviction, it was a hung jury. Another mistrial could drag the process out indefinitely, forcing Daniel and his family to relive the trauma once more. His greatest fear wasn't prison, it was being stuck in legal limbo forever. While the jury deliberated, Daniel retreated to a private room at the courthouse with his 6-month-old daughter. Cradling her in his arms, he whispered a promise she was too young to understand, that her father was innocent, that one day she would know the truth. And then, after hours of waiting, justice finally arrived. The courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read. Not guilty. At 41 years old, Daniel Villegas collapsed to his knees, overcome with emotion. Applause erupted from the gallery. After more than 25 years, he was not only free, he was vindicated. The jury had seen the truth that had eluded the courts for so long. Still, even in the face of the verdict, the district attorney's office stood firm. They continued to insist Daniel was guilty, claiming there were no other suspects. But legally, the case was closed. They had no grounds for appeal. Daniel had finally cleared his name. But freedom did not mean ease. Life after prison came with its own battles. Despite being exonerated, Daniel faced threats on social media and found it difficult to fully participate in the lives of his children, especially at school, because of the shadow cast by his wrongful conviction. Yet again, he leaned on those who never gave up on him. John Mimbela, the businessman who had spearheaded his fight for justice, offered Daniel a job as a construction foreman. Later, he helped him transition into a role at a law office. But Daniel didn't stop there. He began sharing his story, speaking at universities, conferences, and community events. He recounted how a young, innocent teenager was swallowed by a broken system, and how faith, family, and perseverance pulled him back out. Daniel Villegas had become a symbol, a living reminder of the devastating consequences of wrongful convictions. His story inspired documentaries, news specials, and podcasts that chronicled the life of a teenager who had spent half his life fighting for his innocence. But for Daniel, freedom wasn't the end of the journey. It was the beginning of a new battle, one for healing, justice, and dignity. Then, in July 2024, that journey took another unexpected turn. On July 17th, Daniel Villegas was arrested once again, this time on a charge of domestic assault in El Paso, Texas. According to a police report, officers responded to a call regarding an alleged domestic dispute at an apartment near a school in the city's northeast. A woman, unnamed in the court records, accused Daniel of grabbing her wrist during an argument, allegedly causing her pain. Police noted what they described as dry blood and scratches on her wrist and forearm. Daniel was taken to the El Paso County Jail, but released the same day after posting a $2,500 bond. The news sent shockwaves through the community. For many, the name Daniel Villegas was synonymous with injustice. Now, he faced a new accusation, one that risked reigniting public doubt. But unlike his past ordeal, this case followed a very different path. After a 2-day trial, a jury found Daniel not guilty of the charge. His attorney criticized the district attorney's office, calling the case baseless and irresponsible. For Daniel, the verdict was both a relief and a painful reminder that his legal battles were far from over. At the time of this arrest, Daniel was still deeply entrenched in a federal lawsuit against the city of El Paso and several members of the police department. Filed in 2015, the civil case alleged serious violations of his constitutional rights. It accused detectives of coercing a false confession when Daniel was only 16 years old and of suppressing key evidence that could have exonerated him. The civil suit remained active in the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Texas, with no set trial date. And while the exact amount of compensation owed to Daniel had not been disclosed as of mid-2025, records showed that wrongful convictions in Texas were costing the state up to $80,000 per case, sometimes more. But Daniel's fight was never about money. It was about reclaiming lost time, about shedding the identity forced upon him by a flawed system. He had missed the best years of his life, his 20s, his 30s, watching from behind bars while the world moved on without him. The damage wasn't just emotional. It followed him into every aspect of his post-prison life. Social stigma, distrust, and lingering suspicion made reintegration painfully slow. He couldn't even fully participate in his children's school activities because of the history tied to his name. Still, Daniel pushed forward. He remained in El Paso, working, rebuilding, and raising his family. Thanks to the continued support of his friend and mentor, John Mimbela, he had a steady job and opportunities to speak publicly about the dangers of forced confessions and judicial misconduct. He became a regular speaker at university events, sharing his experience to inspire reform and highlight the voices of others still trapped in the same broken system. His case stood as a haunting example of what happens when justice moves too quickly and too carelessly. But it also became a story of endurance, a testament to the power of family, faith, and perseverance. Daniel Villegas had fought not just for his freedom, but for the right to start over without the weight of a past he never chose. Even after being exonerated, the struggle didn't end. Each day brought new challenges, closed doors, cautious glances, doubts that still lingered. Yet he faced them all with quiet resolve. Daniel's life remains an uncomfortable mirror, reflecting the flaws of the American justice system. His voice now echoes on behalf of those still inside, those whose names we don't know, but whose stories may be all too similar. Because the most unsettling truth is this: how many more like Daniel are still locked away, waiting for someone to believe them?
Thanks for tuning in to Unreal True Crime. If you're intrigued by mysteries from around the world, check out our new channel, Latin Crimes, where we dive into the gripping true crime stories of Latin America. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations.